Hey 8th graders, how's it going? So we're continuing on in our graphing and we are going to talk about graphing using intercepts. Graphing using the different intercepts. So we're going to use this equation. It's called the slope-intercept form. So slope intercept form. Okay, slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b. Y equals mx plus b, where m is your slope. I hope you remember that. We've seen that used for slope before. We saw that in our last lessons, that m represents the slope. Remember, slope is rise over run. So slope is your change in y's over your change in x's to find your slope. Slope is this right here. And then b is our y-intercept. B is our y-intercept. I know, it's confusing. They put b instead of y, but our equation is y equals, so we couldn't put y for that. So in your vocabulary document, it talks about two different points called the y-intercept and the x-intercept. And we have that again here, the y-intercept. The y-intercept is where your graph crosses through the y-axis. Your y-intercept is where your graph crosses through the y-axis. It's the point when 0 is x, when x is 0. Excuse me, that's what I meant to say. It's the point in which x is 0. And y is some point on the y-axis where it crosses through. That's your x-axis, your x-intercept. Your y-intercept. Wow, 8th graders, let me try again. Your y-intercept is where x is equal to 0 and your line crosses through the y-axis. Your x-intercept. Your x-intercept is where y is 0 and your line crosses through the x-axis. Your x-intercept is where y is 0 and your line crosses through the x-axis. The x-axis. And so you can find it by, again, making your chart, and you can plug in 0 for x and y depending on which one they ask you to find. By making your chart and plugging in 0 for x or y, you can find the intercept that it asks you to find. But you can also graph from this equation. You can graph from this because you know a point. You know the y-intercept is going to be 0 whatever, right? Because your y-intercept is where x is 0. So it'll be 0, comma b, 0, comma whatever number this is. And then you know your slope. So you know how much you rise and or run. So you can graph from this. From this simple equation, you can begin graphing. So if you have something like y equals negative 4x minus 2. Y equals negative 4x minus 2. And it told you graph. You can! So how do we do that? So we know that this number in front of our x is our slope. So our slope, which I write as m, that's how you write slope, is negative 4 over 1. Because 4, a whole number, can be written as a fraction. Remember, slope is usually a fraction. So it's negative. That means I go down 4 and to the right 1. Down 4 to the right 1. And then my y-intercept, my b, is 0, negative 2. See, it says minus 2. This is an important note. Minus 2. And in our notes up here, we have it's mx plus b. So if it's minus b down here, that means you're adding a negative, and they just wrote minus. They just wrote a subtraction sign. But this is also the same thing as negative 4x plus a negative 2. So your y-intercept is -2. So what does this look like on a graph? So I need to go to 0, -2, which is right there. 0, -2. And then I can graph. I can choose 2 more points. Looks like I'm going down 4 and to the right 1. Forgive me as I try to do this. 1, 2, 3, 4, to the right 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, to the right 1. Draw a somewhat straight line. Okay, now think about what you know about slopes of a line. It's a negative slope, -4/1. It's a negative slope. So does this line look like how a line should look for a negative slope? Remember you learned about positive slopes, negative slopes, slopes of 0, and undefined slopes. Does this line look like it should for a negative slope? Yep, negative slopes rise from right up to the left. It starts in the right-hand corner and goes up. Or it goes down from left to right. So this looks perfect for a negative slope. Now, just look, you don't have to try and find it, but just look, you could see about where the x-intercept would be. Where's the point in which y would be 0 and it would cross the x-axis? Somewhere about here. It's going to be negative again, just like everything else has been negative, because it's on the over here in quadrant 2. So it's going to be negative, somewhat. Not super negative, although my graph is not very to scale, as we can tell. So, let's look at a different example. Let's look at something like y minus 1 equals -2/3 x. So, I said we can graph from this equation y equals mx plus b. But does this one that I just gave you look like this? Y needs to be by itself. So we need to get this equation to look like this. We need to get y on its own side of the equal sign. So to do that, to solve for y, we need to add 1. Add 1. So now our equation reads y equals -2/3x plus 1. And now we can begin to identify the different parts of our equation. So, let's start with the slope. Start with the slope. Our slope, yep, that coefficient in front of the x is our slope. It's -2/3. -2/3. And your y-intercept is +1. What does that look like as ordered pair? 0, 1 is how that would look as an ordered pair. Because remember, your y-intercept is where your line crosses the y-axis, which is where x is 0. So x is 0. So, how would we graph this? We'd start by graphing the y-intercept, and then we'd use our slope to find at least two more points. Use your slope to find at least 2 more points. So we go down 1, 2, and to the right 1, 2, 3. Go down 1, 2, to the right 1, 2, 3. And then we draw our somewhat straight line, and that's our graph. Again, remember, that is this. Let's check. Let's check and make sure we did this right. We have a negative slope, so is this the way our line of a negative slope should look? About right. And then we see here that it crosses at 1 if my line is correct. If my line is correct, it would cross at about 1. Give or take. It's not too bad. Looks about right. Let's see what we can do here. Let's see what we can look at one more. One more. Let's look at This one. What does it read? Y equals negative 5 minus 1/2 x. Now we're close. We are so close. But this equation does not look like this. My coefficient and my x need to be in the front. My y-intercept needs to be in the back. This equation needs to match in order that equation. So how do we rearrange this around? Y equals, and then we're just going to take this, even the negative, and pop it on the other side. Negative 1/2 x minus 5. We just plopped that over, flipped it around, and now we can identify our points and graph. So now we can say that our slope, what's the coefficient in front of the x? Negative 1/2. What's my b? I have a minus 5. And remember, our equation reads b plus 5, or plus b. So we know that this is plus a negative 5. So my b is negative 5. So my y-intercept, b, negative 5. And then we can graph from those two pieces of information. We can graph. So we start at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We start at negative 5 on y. Wow, this is just a little negative graph here. Because we're going down 1 and 2 to the right. Down 1, 2 to the right. Ooh, not a straight line, Miss Chauncey. Because remember, crash course again on slope. Slope is your rise over your run. Your up and down, your y-axis over your x-axis. Your y-axis over your x-axis. Now, with negatives, you might be thinking, Miss Chauncey, well, which one do I do? Which one do I do? Which one do I make negative? Which one do I go down or to the left? How do I know? It doesn't matter. Here's why. Look, I did 1 negative. I made 1 my negative number, which means I go down for y's. When you have a negative number on your slope, you go down. And then I made 2 positive, so I went to the right because the right's positive side of your y, your x's. But what if I made my 1 my positive number and my 2 my negative number? What if I went up 1 and to the right 2? Still a point on the line. What if I went up 1 and to the right 2 again? Still a point on my line. See, it doesn't matter which one you do your negative. As long as one of your numbers has a negative, it'll still be correct on your line. It just depends if you're going towards the left or towards the right. It's all that's determining if you're going towards the left or towards the right. Now, don't forget this little part right here. This equation that you have needs to match the slope-intercept form, including that plus b. So if you have a subtracting a whole number at the tail end of your equation, that means that you're adding a negative and they just wrote it as a subtraction, and that you need to remember that your y-intercept is negative. Otherwise, this line would completely change if I graphed it up here at 5 instead of down here at negative 5. It'd be a completely different line, and it wouldn't be correct. It wouldn't be correct, plain and simple. So, remember that you need to, if it is minus 5, it is adding a negative, and that your y-intercept is negative. Remember, your y-intercept is where x is 0, and your line crosses the y-axis. Your x-intercept is where y is 0, and your line crosses the x-axis.